Thanks for having me here. The paper I'm going to talk about is fiscal policy and debt management with incomplete markets. It's a joint work with Tom Sargent, Mike Golosov, and David Anmol. So the main question which we are going to focus here is how fiscal policy should respond to aggregate shocks. And in this way, it's going to be quite complementary to what David presented. He emphasized a lot on idiosyncratic risk. This paper is going to be all about aggregate risk. The three ingredients, we want to answer this question in a world where agents are heterogeneous, markets offer some kind of limited state contingency, and transfers can be used for redistribution. So if you look at the US budget or how the US finances budget, you see that the government typically has some amount of limited state contingency. It could come from the fact that there is inflation which moves around, or there's a maturity structure which the government plays. And the existing benchmarks in the literature, which is either complete markets or a risk-free bond, do not fit what we see in the data. So what we are going to do here is we are going to develop a model where there is there's more flexibility than these two extremes, and try to see what happens to how how fiscal policy responds. The other important thing in the data is that most of the expenditure these days is on various kinds of transfers. So both these elements, limited state contingencies and the use of transfers for redistribution, are going to be the key things which we are going to focus. The way we are going to think about heterogeneity is that agents are going to differ in productivities and assets. The way we'll think about limited state contingency is that we'll have an asset whose payoff depends on the aggregate shock, and all agents are going to trade this asset. The tax system which we are going to look at is an affine tax system where there is where labor income is taxed with a slope and an intercept. Both the slope and intercepts are going to depend on the sequence of aggregate shocks, so it's going to vary over time, but it's going to be uniform across agents. Combining the fact that agents are heterogeneous, so this point came up before. Combining the fact that agents are heterogeneous and the intercept is uniform across agents means that whether or not to respond to aggregate shocks by changing transfers is not a trivial question, and that's going to pose an interesting problem for the planner of whether to use distortionary slopes or intercepts when it faces an aggregate shock. So how do the policy responses look? So let me start with something which is quite well known in the literature. If markets are complete, the recommendation for optimal taxes is quite straightforward. You have state contingent returns on your assets. You can use that to hedge all fluctuations in deficit. So remember, the costs here, or in this class of problems, comes from the cost of fluctuation taxes. If you have state contingent returns, you can actually implement smooth taxes, in fact, constant taxes, and all the variation in the deficit can be hedged by state contingent returns. What we'll have is something different. In our world, markets are incomplete, so you cannot keep taxes constant. But what we find is that there is a tendency of the assets to revert to a particular level. I'm going to call that the target level, and it will have a particular feature. It is that level of asset that maximizes the hedging possibilities for the government, and accordingly minimizes the fluctuation rates. So the important question is, what is this target level of assets, and how does it vary across primitives? So what we're going to show is that we're going to develop some theory where we characterize this long-run level of assets in terms of the nature of the incompleteness of markets. So remember, this paper is moving it's going to be less complete than fully complete markets, but it's going to offer more state contingencies than a bond. So what is going to be important is, when we develop the theory, we are going to be agnostic about what exact market structure there is, and depending on how returns co-vary with the government's needs for revenue. So how much spanning does the asset markets allow you? That is going to determine both the level of the asset, so the absolute level, the sign, and how fast you go there. In particular, if returns are higher when the government needs more revenue, it makes sense to accumulate assets, because this extra revenue can be used to pay off higher deficits. On the other hand, if returns are negatively correlated with needs for revenue, you may want to accumulate debt. And so what determines whether returns are positively or negatively correlated with needs for revenues? And so we could think of various stories. A typical business cycle risk, interest rates would be countercyclical. So in recessions, interest rates would be higher. That would push me towards positive assets. But you could think of other stories, that's the one we want to explore here more, but you could think of other stories where there is default risk, where returns are low, where payoffs are lower in bad times, typically, and then you'll have a positive covariance. You may want to accumulate debt in that world. So I will try to develop this intuition more tightly, and then what we are going to do is we are going to go to data on the US. We are going to go to the US data. We are going to figure out what is the amount of state contingency present in the data by looking at realized returns on the government portfolio. Disciplining our market incompleteness using that object. And the second element, which is the inequality, that we are going to discipline using how the cross-section distribution of earnings moves over business cycle. It was mentioned in the discussion, the analysis of the Fatih Gouvenin, who has new data to shed light on these moments. So we are going to use that. And we are going to feed in, using these two moments or stylized properties of these two data series, we are going to calibrate our primitives and compare the optimal plan and relate it back to the US policies.
So just to understand, so you're not allowing for a complete maturity spectrum?
No, we are not. So it's going to be a one-period bond with an exogenous payoff structure. So, and I'll speak more about what maturity does. So what you want to think about is that at the background, there is a maturity structure which gives me a portfolio. And at the end of the day, I'm talking about the portfolio. So the returns on the portfolio could fluctuate. Now, neither am I going to look at how the government varies the portfolio in the data. Neither my planner is going to move that dimension.
You postulate the return from it.
Exactly. So I'm going to take that as given. And it's an interesting extension which we have been thinking about, is that beside the taxation problem, so the government is going to choose the level of the portfolio and the tax system. It will also choose the composition of the portfolio to help it hedge. And it typically would. But I will abstract from that. What you see here is that even without allowing the government, you get some insights about how it wants to, what is the goal it wants to achieve. And then the more tools you give him, he's going to do that better and better. So that will be more clear. So what do we find? The first thing we find is that the target level of assets is positive. And this comes from the intuition which I was giving here. We are going to focus here on business cycle risks. So interest rates would be countercyclical. If interest rates are countercyclical, they're higher in recessions. And the spanning argument which I gave you before, by accumulating assets, you're going to pay lower interest in recessions, and you're going to have higher revenues in recessions, which you can use to offset the deficits. We will have something to say about the speed of convergence. In the theory section, we will develop what properties of the payoff of the market incompleteness. Say that again?
I just said it's very slow.
It is very slow, and this is something which we find, and we'll try to understand this where this slowness comes from. It is exactly going to come from what is the nature of market incompleteness. So it could be fast. It happens to be slow when we look at the US data. So we'll get a very clear understanding of what determines the speed. And so it turns out to be very slow in the US data with a half-life of 547 years. So in economic terms...
You're saying that's slow. Sounds about right to me.
So in economic, it would be something like this. If the debt to GDP is 100%, now, you pay off 2 percentage points every 10 years.
Yeah, so maybe more like a random walk is really what you've got.
Yeah. So it is important to also understand what happens in the transition and or what happens over business cycle frequencies. What we find is that both tax rates and transfers are in the optimal plan are smooth. And fluctuations in deficits are primarily financed by asset purchases. This also explains why the speed of convergence is slow, because what you're doing is that whenever you get a bad shock, instead of moving taxes and transfers, you're borrowing a little bit. And then every time you do that, you change your asset positions, which means that, of course, you have to pay it back somehow. So the response of the tax and transfers is slow is small on impact, but it's very persistent. And when we compare those properties to the US, actual US taxes and the properties of the US tax rates and transfers, we find that both in the data and in the optimal plan on impact, things do not move that much. On that level, both tax rates are not that volatile in the data, they're not that volatile in the optimal plan. But the main difference comes in the persistence, as I was explaining. The optimal plan, these changes are small but persist for a very long time. In the US, our estimates of the US tax policy, debt is repaid much faster. So I'll have more to say when I get to the quantitative section. So the plan of the talk is as follows. I will set up the environment and then move on to a simple setting to develop intuition about this target level, the speed of convergence, and the long-run properties of the optimal plan. It will turn out that the simple example not only tightens the intuition, but gives you a very good input into this quantitative section. It will help you get an order of magnitude for various objects which I'm talking about. And then I'll tell you how we do the quantitative part. The quantitative part was possible because of David's new methods. So naturally, this paper fits in a long tradition of optimal taxation with aggregate shocks, starting from Barrow, who did optimal taxation with incomplete markets, Ayagari, Marcel Cephala, Sargent, Fari. It is also going to connect to optimal taxation with complete markets, which is Lucas, Stokey, and Verney. And in some ways, it's going to link to this argument which Angelotos and Bura Nicolini had. So they studied an inverse problem. So they started with a complete market allocation, and they asked, is there a maturity structure which can completely replicate this complete markets allocation? And this goes back to a question. So we are not going to do that exercise. We're going to say that let's fix the maturity structure and see how far we can go with whatever. So we are not going to allow the optimal plan to choose whatever maturity. One property of those models is that if you actually look at the optimal portfolio, it's crazy. So,
and then you have a little bit of idiosyncratic risk in the returns. Government securities, liquidity risk.
Yeah, you would never do that. Exactly. And all those features are going to show up here. That it so happens that there's a lot of collinearity across maturities. So the only way you can span anything is by holding super large positions. If you allow the government to do it, he'll do it, but that's not a very robust prediction. So we are going to abstract from that in that sense. All right. So let me get down to the environment. There are going to be n types of infinitely lived agents of mass ni and a benevolent plan. So n could be very large, like David, but it could be, we could think of n as types. And that's what I want you to think now. N are like finite types. In the quantitative section, there are going to be 9, capturing the deciles of the US population, but think of these as classes of agents. The preferences are standard. Agents are going to care about consumption. How does this work?
Wait, have you turned it around?
Yeah, okay, I got it. So agents are going to care about consumption and they're going to dislike labor. The preferences are standard, expected utility added over time. We're going to have a planner, so we're going to think of the government as a Pareto planner who has weights over all these agents, and he's going to aggregate these utilities using this Pareto weights omega I. So Again, at this point, I'm not going to take a stand on what omega I is. We'll discuss what happens if the finance cares a lot about productive guys, a lot about unproductive guys. And in the quantitative section, I'm going to use a selection. I'm going to pick these Pareto weights in a very particular way. The aggregate shocks here are coming from Markov. So the aggregate shocks are going to be described by an underlying Markov process of ST. And the way, the next slide will tell you where this ST appears. So there is no capital. Output is linear in labor supply. Theta I is the productivity of agent I, and that depends on the aggregate state S. Li is the labor supply of agent I times theta I times the mass will give you total output. So that's the technology. And now I'll be more precise about the asset market. There's going to be a single bond with exogenous payoffs P of ST. And agents are going to trade this claims to this financial securities. What I mean by agent is all private agents and the government. So that's the only object you can trade amongst each other. The budget constraint would make it, it might be useful to go through the budget. So agent I, he comes in with some previous holdings of this asset, and it pays off P of ST depending on the shock. This is his labor supply. This is how much he is the post-tax labor income, and capital T is transfers. So this is how much resources he has. He can either consume it or buy more units of this particular bond. It is going to be convenient to write this budget constraint in returns. So what I call returns would be the payoffs divided by the price of the security in T minus 1. And instead of B tilde, which is the face value, I'm going to call BT, which is the price of the asset times B tilde. It's like the market value of assets. And when we go to the quantitative section, we're going to match the market value of government debt to the data. So doing this transformation, there is an analogous government budget constraint, which is expenditures. Capital B is the assets of the government. BT, the transfer, so these are all outflows, and the inflows are returns on existing assets and the tax revenue. The market clearing conditions are standard. Consumption, private consumption plus public consumption is total output, and it's a closed economy. So all these assets are traded off, are zero in net supply if you include both the private and the public assets. So let me emphasize a couple of key things. One is the shock. The aggregate shock shows up as affecting productivities, affecting payoffs, and it can affect the government expenditures. So those are three places where it could move around. There is no capital, so the only asset here is a financial asset which is in zero net supply. And last thing, I mentioned this before, but I want to emphasize this. There is group specific risk. So theta i's can be different across agents. So given an aggregate shock, different agents might have different drops or gains in the TFP. All right. Any questions on this?
What's the initial debt situation?
All right. Great. So that's going to be an initial condition. There are three objects. It's the initial distribution of debt and the Markov state. Given that, we can define, and a particular tax policy, we can define the competitive equilibrium, which would be a sequence of consumption allocations, labor allocations, and asset purchases for the agents that solve individual optimality and prices such that individuals optimize and markets clear. What we are going to look for is a Ramsey plan or Ramsey equilibrium, which is the best competitive equilibrium the government can achieve. So given policy, you have a competitive equilibrium, the government is going to choose policies that gets the best competitive equilibrium. And when I say best, it's in terms of the criterion function which I laid down before. The Pareto weighted lifetime utility of all agents is highest. So I'll speak more about how we set this when we go to the quantitative section, how we set these initial conditions. We're going to go back to data to look at the cross-sectional distribution of assets and the level of debt, and we're going to run our economy from that point. But that's something which we have to choose when we go forward. So what is there on the table? there are aggregate shocks. There are some fluctuations which come from the market, the particular market structure which we impose. That is the P vector which we had in the environment. So the government is going to accept fluctuations on earnings, which comes from this limited state contingency. On the other hand, it has two instruments. It has taxes and transfers, which it can respond now or it can respond in future. And the way it would push the fluctuations in the future is by accumulating debt or decumulating by changing its asset positions. So what is going to be key for what policy mix the government is going to use is what is the exact nature of market incompleteness and how much it cares about redistribution. So Pareto weights and the matrix and the vector P. Those are the two primitives that are going to shape these choices. So to get some analytical results and also to develop tight intuitions, we are going to move to now a simpler economy which has quasi-linear preferences. So let me lay down more accurately. There are going to be two agents. Both agents, two types of agents. Both agents are going to have a utility function which is linear in consumption and it has curvature in the disutility from labor. Gamma is the inverse of the Frisch elasticity. So the way to think about these two agents is that there's a productive agent and an unproductive agent, in the sense that one of the agent has productivity equal to 0, so he cannot work, and the other one has some productivity theta. N and omega would be the mass of the productive agent and the Pareto weight the planner assigns on the productive agent. For this example, the shocks are going to be IID, and they're only going to affect government expenditures and payoffs. So, but we are going to be arbitrary in terms of what is the correlation between these two objects. We are going to impose a non-negativity constraint on the unproductive guy. So this is going to stand in for the cost of transfers. You cannot, in a more general environment, there's going to be inada conditions which is going to give you exactly the same cost. So you can think of the multiplier on this constraint as the effective cost of fluctuating transfers. Because if you didn't have this constraint, you may want to use, and agents are quasi-linear, you may ideally want to use the intercept of transfers to fluctuate all shocks. But you cannot do that because it might impose negative constraints on negative consumption on agent 2. This is just a device.
So what's going on here? Are they drawing these shocks? Because you could have both guys not working. Can you have that?
But then there is zero output.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So, are you allowing that or what?
No. Theta 1 is going to be strictly larger than 0. The shocks are only to G. Sorry. Oh, I see where your question is. They are going to be fixed. The shocks are only to G now. Yeah. And in the quantitative section, we'll have theta moving around as well. But in terms of this example, what we need is some movements in the needs for revenue. You could get it from moving theta. You could get it from moving G. It so happens that just focusing on G makes the math easier. But all statements which I say about higher G is kind of more or less is the same thing as a lower theta 1. But for the rest couple of slides, these two numbers are going to be constant. So we are going to follow the standards in the traditional way of looking at optimal taxation problems and go to a primal approach. What I mean by a primal approach is we're going to replace taxes and prices from agents' budget constraints using the optimality constraint and recast the government's maximization problem only in terms of allocations. So the simplicity of the quasi-linear world allows us to focus on, the price of this asset is always 1 over beta. So the only thing which moves the returns is the payoff structure, which we're going to have results for different payoff structures. So that makes one thing easier. The first order condition of the agent just gives you labor supply in terms of the tax rate. So you can replace that from its budget constraint. It also happens that since there are two agents and you can always move transfers, effectively the government cares about the net asset position. So you can set the assets of the second agents to 0. So when you take into account all these three things, At the end of the day, the government is maximizing this utility and is subject to just one constraint, which I'm going to call the implementability constraint. The role of this constraint is that an allocation, which this was mentioned earlier also yesterday, the role of this constraint is that an allocation which maximizes the welfare subject to this constraint can be replicated in a competitive equilibrium. So there will exist taxes and prices such that the same allocation at an equilibrium given those at those prices, given those taxes and prices. It turns out that the implementability constraint, I'm sorry, I'm doing this too often. This implementability constraint can be organized very in a convenient way. So ZT is the total tax revenues. I showed you here that labor supply is just a function of tax rates. So tau times L can be only written in terms of allocations. So the total tax revenue is just in terms of allocation. What you see over here is roughly the government's budget constraint. The government is choosing its asset positions, its tax revenues. It comes in with some particular some asset position it chose from the previous period, and it faces shocks to expenditure and shocks to this payoff. So just to fix your ideas, why is this an implementability constraint? It works this way. If the government knows the total tax revenues, you can back out the labor supply. If you know the labor supply, you know the total output. You know the total output, and you know how much the government is saving. So you know the tax revenues, you know the government saving, how much the government is saving, and how much it's spending, and what are the returns on the existing bond holdings. The difference of these things is just transfers. That's the consumption of the unproductive guy. It didn't work, and we normalize his assets to zero. So we have total output, we have consumption of the unproductive guy. From the resource constraint, we get the consumption of the productive guy. So that gives you the entire allocation. So it's enough to solve this problem and back out everything else through the sequence of arguments I made. Why is this a useful way to think about the problem? Because it puts into focus exactly the problem which is inherent in this environment. There are two sources of risk. So, okay. First, let me introduce some terminology which I'm going to use in the next few slides. B times P divided by beta, which is the total returns from previous holdings, minus G of ST plus 1 can be thought of as cash in hand. You come in with some returns, and that's the only place where exogenous shocks happen. So what this shows you is that there are two sources of risk. There are fluctuations in G and there are fluctuations in P, which affect how much cash in hand the government has. So the government cannot, in this world, since P and G are exogenous, it cannot affect the covariance between P and G, but it can affect how much, it can affect this thing. This is a choice variable. It can change the level of its portfolio. And what it wants to do at the end of the day is it wants to minimize the variance in cash in hand, because the variance in cash in hand is going to translate into variance in taxes and transfers, which it doesn't like. So how to think about, how would it use this lever which it has, the level of assets, to minimize the variance in cash in hand? So think of this simple problem. I've just written the cash in hand term here, and this problem is minimizing the variance of this object. So this is a least square problem, and we can without loss of generality always decompose this payoff vector into two parts. The one part which is perfectly correlated with G of S, and a part which is orthogonal to G of S. What does that do? That will give us two terms. The first term, so it's just splitting the same variance minimizing problem. The first term here is minimizing this. The first term here is minimizing, so choosing B to minimize the fluctuations which are completely correlated with G. And second term here is how much the orthogonal component contributes to the variance. So for a minute, think that if the orthogonal component was absent, and you were lucky enough to have a payoff structure which was completely collinear with your needs for revenue, which is the G, you could in fact find a level of B that puts these terms exactly to zero. And that level, it's just a least square problem. That level is given by the variance of G over the covariance of P and G. So here you see that what is important both for the sign of this choice and the level is how payoffs co-move with expenditures. A positive sign here would mean you accumulate assets, a negative sign here mean you accumulate debt, and the magnitude of the co-movement will tell you whether you accumulate more or less of assets. Obviously, the more general case would be where you do not have perfect spanning. And what happens there, and you can see that if you want to put this term to 0, you're going to face fluctuations which come from this orthogonal component. So there is a tension which the government faces. To do perfect spanning, it wants to go to this particular level B star, but which is different from 0, and it's going to, the closer it goes there, this term magnifies. So it wants to somehow balance both these tensions, not to have orthogonal variations in deficits, in its budget constraint, but to have as much spanning as possible.
So this P hat of S is something that's...
It's exactly the orthogonal component. So take P, project it on G, and take the residual.
So, but this is something like which is not, it's not like a fundamental fluctuation.
And you will see that in data.
It's like the liquidity risk I was agreeing to.
Yeah, everything. Yeah, it's it is
some nonlinear. Okay.
It could be that. Yeah, so it could be nonlinear movements in P's, but it is something. Those are all. It's not noise. It's coming from unmodeled assumptions, which the government has no control over. It turns out that this orthogonal component is large in data when we look at actual properties of returns. So I have to rush a bit. So I'm going to be quick. I'm going to skip some things, but so let me tell you. So these two objectives, that not to have orthogonal variations but to span as much as possible, gives us an idea of where the target level of debt would be, and it's a balance of these two objectives. So P star is the component which is parallel, which pushes you towards B star P. Variance of P star over variance of P is the relative size of P. It gives you this relative size of the orthogonal component, and that pushes you towards 0, because that's the way you will minimize that term. So the ergodic, all these are properties of the ergodic distribution of debt. Once you know what happens, debt or assets, once you know what happens to assets, you can figure out what happens to tax rates and other things. The variance around this level is given by the size of the orthogonal component. An important thing which we develop here is how fast you go to that mean level. And it turns out to depend on the following properties of the payoff. It depends on the correlation of payoffs with fundamentals and the variance of the orthogonal component. The intuition is this way. The more correlated it is, you want to go there faster. But if there is a larger orthogonal component, you want to also go there faster, because not going there gives you a lot of fluctuations which you don't like.
How come this doesn't depend on the level of debt? Because you have a Laffer.
This is a how? Huh?
You have a Laffer curve here, right?
Yes.
So
you'll always be on the left of the Laffer curve.
Yeah.
No, sorry. What is the question? What doesn't depend on?
Why does the convergence rate not depend on the steady state level of debt? Because the steady state level of debt means what's the steady state level of taxes, and that means what is the marginal, this utility generated by generating conversions.
Yeah. So okay, hold on. So there are two responses. First, what I call as convergence rate is the expected change in B relative to its current size. So the current level of debt is here. This is just the AR1 coefficient. And secondly, this comes from an approximation to the actual laws of motion. So there might be higher order terms which include the level of debt, but those turn out to be smaller. So it does matter. But what you want to think about is half-life and quantity which doesn't depend on the level. How fast? What is the rate at which you pay back existing debts? I'm really running out of time. So I'm going to just one sentence about. So what I described earlier was I didn't talk about redistribution. I talked about how different properties of P affected the government's spanning objectives. So this quasi-linear world turns out to be useful here because if Pareto weights on the productive agents are very high, transfers are not used at all. Because using transfers means subsidizing consumption to agents which you don't like. For low enough Pareto weights, for more productive, more redistributionary governments, you can use transfers as well as the asset market to hedge risks. And what turns out is that the the variance of minimizing cash in hand is exactly the same objective which you should think about. But now there are two tools. It is the more redistributionary you are, you can also use transfers to minimize the variance. So pretty much the same insights go through. Risk aversion, just one line. With risk aversion, it's not just the exogenous movements in payoffs, but the movements in marginal utilities which matter. So the effective payoff for the government is P times UC. So the exogenous times the endogenous. UC is endogenous, would be endogenous with risk aversion. But the gain from the quasi-linear world is that you effectively want to, so what you want to think, so P times UC maps into the P in the quasi-linear world. So even if you want to study a risk-free bond with curvature, you first want to know what happens in a more general world. So let me quickly describe the quantitative model. I literally have 5 minutes. So there are n types, the n is 9. So 9, think of the deciles of the US working population, 10 decile to the 98th decile. So this part of the distribution has remained relatively stable over the 30 years which we are looking at. So it helps us calibrate the inequality and other things. The primitives would be, there is going to be a TFP shock, so now theta's are going to move around. The payoff, the exogenous part of the payoff will have the two components as motivated by the orthogonal and the parallel component. So there's going to be a loading chi on the innovation to productivity shock, and there's going to be a loading sigma p on an orthogonal on a shock which is orthogonal to the fundamental shock. For agents, individual agents' productivity, there's going to be a constant which is indexed to agent I. So that's the average productivity, and then agents are going to move. The productivity of all agents is going to move around as the economy goes through booms and recession, which is this productivity shock. What we have here is a convenient way to capture the idea that different deciles may have different falls in earnings in booms and recessions. So what you see here is that there is a factor M which loads on the difference between 0.9 and something which is increasing in I. So think of I as I being 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if I was 9, this term is absent. If I was 1, you have the first agent effectively faces a larger drop in his TFP. This is going to be calibrated to the facts which were reported in FATI. Over the last 4 recessions, the relative drop in the 10th percentile of earnings in the 10th percentile agent is about 3 times that of the 90th percentile. So that will inform us how M should be. Yeah. So let me describe the strategy here. The data we have is on earnings and returns. The objects which we want are productivities and payoffs. So to map these two, we have to, the earnings and returns are endogenous. So what we're going to do is, we're going to first take an arbitrary policy that best describes the US tax policy, solve for a competitive equilibrium using this arbitrary policy, calibrate the payoff and the productivity distribution using outcomes in the endogenous outcomes in the competitive equilibrium to what we saw in the data. Fix Pareto weights such that the average optimal tax rate matches the observed tax rate. So that's the disciplining device for Pareto weights. So on an average, the optimal tax rate has the same distortions as what we see in data. The difference is going to be how you respond to shocks. So this is about responses and not whether or not what is the average tax rate. By construction, we'll have the average tax rate to be equal to what it is in the data.
I got confused. What's M? You had mass of M was mass of
No.
the 2 times.
No. N. That was N. M is, give me 1 second. M is a parameter which will control how different is the recession for the 10th percentile guy relative to the 90s. It will control inequality.
What is N now? It's
N.
1/9?
Yeah, because we have deciles. Yes, yes,
In the computations of the
yeah.
Ramsey plan, did you convert all inequalities to equalities?
Did I?
Inequalities you had.
Yes,
You had a lot of inequalities along the way.
yes.
In the computations, did you convert the inequalities to equalities?
No,
So you respected the
we
inequalities?
respect the
Are they
inequality.
always binding? Are they binding at all?
Oh, inequalities like inequality constraints?
Yes.
No, so
Remember,
Yeah.
was that?
I see.
I
thought
can't remember the name.
So with risk aversion, you will have another condition. So you will have no inequality.
Budgetary restriction, but you said that the government restrictions were inequalities.
No, so there will be no, effectively there will be no inequalities in the quantitative section because the inequalities which I had in the example was an inequality on the consumption of agent 2 that I don't have to assume when I have, so there is no inequality
I
here.
don't
There
think
is,
the government inequality.
there is no inequality constraint on the government. There is a budget constraint for the government which holds with equality. There is a resource constraint for the economy which holds with equality. And there are budget constraints for all
You call
the,
it the implementation inequality.
exactly, that was not, and so that came because I imposed, yeah, that came because,
I'm trying to understand. I'm not challenging you. I'm not only trying to understand.
no, I'm trying to explain it in the following way.
Okay.
That was a quasi-linear word, and I imposed an extra assumption that the consumption of a particular agent has to hold with an inequality. That inequality, when I did the substitutions, looked through as an inequality in the budget constraint of the government, right? When I have risk aversions, I don't need to assume that consumption has to be positive. It is already implied by another conditions. That was a convenient mathematical device to get cost of transfers moving around, which I don't have to do it. So when I'm doing the full blown problem with curvature, I have no inequalities anywhere.
So you don't use perturbation methods for computing.
I'm going to use
So
perturbation.
you cannot impose in other conditions with perturbation methods.
Why?
How,
Why is that?
How do you impose it? What
I'm not,
slope do you use?
I'm not imposing inada conditions are a property of the utility
You cannot
function.
impose inequality with perturbation methods.
But exactly, so there are no inequality constraints.
All right, let's go.
Anyways, first. So I'm out of time. So I'm going to just.
Can you, in a minute, summarize the numerical, the computational results?
Okay. So there is some functional form regressions which we run to get an idea of what the tax policy is in the US. We solve for the competitive equilibrium. There is a calibration. It's kind of intuitive given my motivation. The key properties of from what we get once we put all this and use Leibniz method, what we get is the following. We get that the government accumulates assets very slowly. Taxes are not that volatile, either in the long run or in the short run. So this table tells you what are the properties of the three instrument, taxes, transfers, and debt after we simulate for a long run. And the next table will give you the same quantities for a transition, for 33 years as we see in the data. Again, what you see is that a lot of action, a lot of movement is in debt. Contrary to our priors, so we have inequality moving around, and there are a lot of incentives for the government to use transfers. Transfers are literally flat, and tax rates are small. Maybe later I'll describe. There is a way we can make sense of these important findings. And the last thing I want to show you is that how the Ramsey allocation compares to the US data. So taxes are not that volatile in the US. Of course, the volatility they are more smoother in the optimal plan, but both numbers are kind of small. The key differences are here. The autocorrelation in the optimal plan is 0.87 relative to 0.30. So that is more persistent. And in the data, it looks like a lot of action comes from transfers. In the optimal plan, that is more volatile than transfers, and transfers are less volatile than, that is more volatile than in the data, and transfers are less volatile. And this kind of has to add up because of the budget constraint. If debt is taking more slack, then transfers don't need to. All right.